Perfect. So, yes, my name is Andreas. I am the librarian at UTS. I'm currently on the UTS campus, so I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, upon whose ancestral lands the city campus now stands. I would like to pay respects to the elders past, present, and emerging, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of the knowledge for this land. And what I wanted to talk to you about today is a training program that we developed, or that was developed by the research data team at UTS Library for the liaison librarians in information services, which is the department that does all of that sort of stuff, to enable them to conduct RDM related consultations and training. The aim of which, as the title suggests, was not just about imparting the necessary knowledge and skills, but also about facilitating the application of this knowledge through that fostering of competence. This may seem like an obvious step, but it's something that's actually quite challenging. As many of you are well aware of, being librarians, liaison librarians do have that sort of there is an expectation that as librarians, we have skills across the entire research lifecycle, from the bread and butter of literature searching through to creating academic profiles, developing publishing strategies and metrics. And RDM has become an increasingly recognized area of importance, both for institutions as well as individual researchers. So it makes sense that liaison librarians develop these competencies more broadly. The challenge is that many librarians are already stretched for time. So even if opportunities for professional development exist, in terms of funding and the training being available, these are often need to be weighed up about whether the training is beneficial at that moment or whether it's something that needs to be attended to later. Finding time for training is not just about how long the training itself takes, but also when the training is actually available. So if it's during session, out of session, those sorts of things. Then there is the need for opportunities to refine the knowledge and skills developed during the training through a practical application of what is actually learned. So this is also something that does not always naturally present itself. And the big problem with this is that it can lead to the new knowledge and skills becoming stagnant and very often even being forgotten. And this sort of perpetuates that barrier of developing confidence in engaging and promoting these skills and services to researchers. So even if the conditions are favorable, there is the need to find or develop appropriate training. And while there are a lot of great training materials available around RDM, many of them are very, very time consuming, or not very, but quite time consuming. And they also often make it difficult for someone to gain both a cursory knowledge of RDM and to apply the different concepts to their specific institutional tools and requirements. So there's often this general knowledge that's gained about sort of best practice and general principles, but applying it to a real world setting often requires those greater opportunities where the person can actually do it and contextualize it through practice. This means that although a librarian may begin to develop some confidence and vocabulary to discuss RDM, they may still struggle to communicate these concepts in a way that is applicable to a researcher's circumstances, which is often what researchers want. As a lot of us know, when we have consultations with researchers around RDM, they very often want clear, direct, immediately applicable advice that will allow them to complete a specific task or frankly to complete a requirement. And applying these general principles to this kind of context is not necessarily intuitive, especially if, as we sort of mentioned, time for professional development is limited by the demands of the job. So we decided to go in-house to develop what we considered the core skills and knowledge for all information services, the librarian, around RDM, but in a way that was very specific to UTS. So the first step we did was developing a clear understanding of what these core skills and knowledge were. So we did this by creating a framework that prioritized the skills needed for the various staff groups involved in RDM related activities, with the focus on the training for the information services staff. Once it was clear what the different levels were based on the group, it was outlined what would be the reasonable specific expectations for each staff member to know. The aptitude was divided into knowledge expressed in I know/understand statements and skills expressed in statements such as I can, demonstrate, locate, direct, whatever the case may be. The aim was to define general RDM principles to specific UTS scenarios. So for example, there is the statement, I know how to define research data in accordance with UTS policy. For the skills, it'll include statements such as I can direct clients to Stash and articulate the main functions, Stash being the UTS platform that's used to create RDMPs like high-level data records and data publications. The next step was assessing, getting staff to do a self-assessment survey so that we could identify which attributes from the framework needed further development, as well as gaining a sense of staff confidence with various RDM-related tasks. The questions directly related to the framework. So the one about defining research data in accordance with UTS policy became, how does UTS define research data? Relatively straightforward. And then another question was sort of about the general components of RDM, which again reflected the framework. And it was a fairly straightforward way for us to get an idea of where the gaps in the knowledge were amongst IS staff. For the skills-based questions, we asked staff to rate their confidence levels with specific tasks. So the first example I've got on the slide is very straightforward about finding relevant content that they could direct researchers to. So very often this would be the various sort of pages we've got either on the back end that are only accessible to researchers or on the library website or something like that. And the other one was more active, so, you know, which sort of translated the can direct clients to Stash and articulate the main functions to how confident are staff helping someone create an RDMP in Stash. So, you know, it's not about can you do this, it's about how comfortable are you doing this. Once we got that sort of idea, we sort of started to develop the learning outcomes based on those knowledge gaps and whatever skills staff were not particularly confident with. Given the team's experience with backward design and creating learning content, sorry, I've jumped ahead of myself here with this slide. Having these clear statements in the framework made it much easier to develop a module using backward design, as the framework itself already possessed clearly articulate statements that could be translated into measurable learning outcomes using something like Bloom's. So for example, one of the module outcomes was members' ability to define research data in accordance with UTS policy, or to be able to demonstrate where to find RDM related material. Given the experience of the RDT team members with backward design and creating learning content, creating the module itself was fairly straightforward. We delivered it via Canvas, and it contained two phases. The first was staff working through the content of the module and completing the various tasks, including a final quiz. And then the second part was something where we directed staff to create a 5 to 10 minute presentation about RDM that they would be able to present to a school or a faculty discipline group meeting, which they then presented firstly to an RDT team, research data team representative for peer review. The idea of this phase 2 was for them to consolidate the training by getting staff to communicate the concepts covered in their own words and into a presentation format that would suit their designated schools or faculty group. And the peer review content essentially created a safe environment for staff to practice delivering the content, as well as getting some feedback from a staff member more experienced in delivering RDM training. The first positive outcome was the staff responses to the module itself. They expressed that the content was accessible, easy to follow, and relevant. One staff member did initially, upon completing phase 1, express that they felt there was too much content. However, by completion of phase 2, they agreed that the information provided was sufficient for RDM and UTS, as well as allowed them to express the information in a format that was applicable and relevant for them. Staff also reported a greater sense of agency in RDM-related activities. They were able to create their own resources and lead discussions and deliver presentations and training to relevant schools and faculties. And staff also indicated a great confidence in using and recommending UTS platforms to researchers, both in formal settings like consultations, but also in ad hoc situations like our live chat function that we also run. So some takeaways from this. The first thing I would say is to have a purpose with the skills you want to nurture. Focus on the skills that staff will actually need rather than going into a huge sort of deep dive around the topic. And with that, you want to sort of prioritize functional content. This will not only make the content easier to apply, but it'll also help consolidate the training through these practical applications. This is also aided by factoring in how the skills will actually be reinforced to develop this confidence, both as part of the training itself, but also how staff can use the skills in a real world context. And this hopefully goes without saying, but ensure that you develop and use measurable learning outcomes to ensure the training stays focused on the priorities you determine at the start.
It looks like we've got 3 that each have 1 like, so I'll start at the one at the bottom. Who has responsibility or a role in providing support in the space for RDM? Is this support provided collaboratively?
So basically, there's only one data librarian, which is myself. So sort of at the end of the day, from a library perspective, it falls to me more broadly. But then the idea is underneath me, there's a research data team, which isn't actually a team as a whole. It's basically a team of people who have faculty responsibilities and then other functional teams. So for example, one of them is on the referencing team, one of them is on the online learning team as well. So it's very scattered and sort of divided. So it's sort of the framework that we sort of developed had that sort of triage model where the idea is there's the base knowledge that everyone has to provide basic support around RDM, which is sort of the stuff that we sort of focused on with the training. RDT has slightly more discipline specific skills, and then there's me who should ideally have all of the answers, although I don't actually claim to, but that's sort of the idea of it. That's just within the library. More broadly at the university, we've also got a new research team which has various sort of data analysts and those sorts of people who look after Stash, which is the platform I've been sort of talking about. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, perfect, thank you. You mentioned that there was one staff member that thought there was perhaps a bit too much content in the module to begin with, but I've got a question. Was there any other pushback from staff at sort of improving their skills in RDM?
I can really recall. I don't know whether that's because no one sort of expressed it directly to me or it didn't sort of eventually come back to me. There didn't seem to be any real pushback. And even the person who sort of had a bit of an issue with the content, like they still did it. So it was sort of, I don't know whether we've got a particularly compliant group of librarians or what the situation is.
Yep, thank you. I've got another one. Do you also have research data management training modules on Canvas that are open to the researchers at UTS?
We do. This is on our Res Hub thing, which I believe my colleague Helen Chan spoke about Res Hub more broadly, but we do have a module there, which was created between sort of various sort of people, so us, the Office of DVCR, e-research, so it's sort of like a collaborative effort, which is there, which is much more sort of researcher focused and sort of covers the stuff more from their sort of perspective.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant. Okay, I think I've got time for one more. Regarding data management questions from clients, how do you ensure that the librarian's skills don't become stagnant and that they keep their skills current?
That's very much the next challenge of this sort of step. So I should probably have given some dates for this. So we did the training in July last year. So we've sort of had the first sort of 6 months around this. And now is very much the sort of the situation where if it was going to start becoming stagnant, it would probably be happening now. We've been getting a fairly steady stream of questions. So I think it's that thing where you sort of, if you sort of give people that initial sort of fostering where they sort of feel comfortable answering the questions, they'll keep answering those sorts of questions. So it's very much one of those things, and something that I try to do is where if someone says, I've got this researcher who wants help with this, if it's a skill that I feel that they could sort of know, so whether it's something like pointing the person in the right direction or whatever the case is, rather than me answering the question directly, I'll give the resources to the librarian who can then give it to the other person. The idea being that, you know, I'm not answering the question and the librarian just sits back. They're actually actively involved in it, rather than, you know, just sitting there and being you know, an extra audience member for me.
Perfect.
But I mean, that's just sort of as an ad hoc at the moment. You might check in with me in a year's time and I might go like, no, they've all forgotten everything.
Oh, well, we'll see how it goes. Sounds like a great start. Thanks so much, Andreas. We've got a couple more questions there. So perhaps perhaps you wouldn't mind if people got in touch with you directly if there's something they wanted to follow up on.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.